Hey, hi, hello and welcome to yet another video, and in this one, we're going to be taking a look at Apple's new SwiftData framework. I'm going to show you how easy it is to implement this framework and add persistent storage to your applications with SwiftData. We'll be using a travel tracking app as an example, with a trip and bucket list items as our models. So let's get into it. I have a sample app here that we're going to use, and the first thing we want to do is create our models. So we're going to create a model folder, and inside that, I will create the two models. And the first one we want is a trip, and I'll create the other file for our bucket list item. Inside our trip, we want to create a class, trip, and I want a trip title. I want a start date of type date, and we also want an array of bucket list items. So we're going to say bucket list. And of course, since we haven't created that, we're going to head over to our other file and create our bucket list item. In our bucket list item, we also want a title for the bucket list item and a boolean for whether or not we've completed this activity. And there we have it. Now we have our bucket list item set up and our trip, which references the bucket list item. We also need to make sure that we include our initializers. So I'll go ahead and do that for our trip and for our bucket list. And there we go. Now, of course, to be able to display this information, we're going to need a view that shows us the list of trips and also another view that allows us to create a new trip. To be able to focus on SwiftData in this video, I've gone ahead and created those views, but I will run you through those to show you exactly what I did to build those views. I've also gone ahead and created a sample trip to be able to display in our initial version of the app. So I have 3 bucket list items to visit Eiffel Tower, try some French food, and visit the Louvre Museum, and I've added those into a Paris trip. So if I jump over to the trips view, you can see it's a standard SwiftUI view. Essentially, I have a state variable to be able to track whether or not we're displaying the new trips view, and I also have a list of trips in an array. Right now, I've only got the Paris trip in that. Then we have a navigation view that encapsulates a list of our trips. So for each of those trips, we're going to display an H stack, and a single trip looks like this. We have an image on our left-hand side, a V stack with our trip title and our trip date. I've then gone ahead and added a navigation title, and of course a toolbar and sheet to be able to display our new trips view. So our toolbar just has a button that toggles the showing new trips view state, and the sheet presents the new trips view. So if I go into the new trip view, this one is also very simple. I have an environment variable to be able to dismiss our view, and then I have a bunch of state variables, one for the title, the start date, and our bucket list items, and I also have one for my new bucket list title. So as I'm typing the title for a new bucket list, I keep track of it with this variable. I've also got a navigation view here with a form inside it to be able to add our trip details. I have one section for the title and the start date, and another section for the bucket list. Inside the bucket list, this is also really straightforward. I've got a text field that keeps track of the bucket list title, and I've also got an onSubmit modifier to be able to create a new bucket list item and add it to the trip. I then have a for each that goes through and shows the list of bucket list items. The rest is pretty standard, navigation title and a toolbar to be able to cancel or save our new trip. So if I go back to the trip view and pop out the canvas, I can click on the plus to add a new trip. Once I enter the trip details, I can then save that or cancel, and I dismiss straight back to the previous view. And this is where we go into adding SwiftData. You won't believe how easy it is to add SwiftData to our existing application. All we need to do is head over to our models and add the model macro. So I'm going to jump over to my trip model. I'm going to import SwiftData, and I'm going to just decorate this model with the model macro. Our trip model now works with SwiftData. One thing you do want to keep in mind though is if you plan on referencing another model that you also want stored in persistent storage with SwiftData, is you also need to mark that with the model macro. So in our case, we're referencing the bucket list, which means we need to go over to our bucket list and also decorate that with the model macro. So import SwiftData and have the @model macro. This now establishes a relationship between the two models. The next thing we're going to look at is the attribute macro. And the attribute macro lets you, as the name suggests, add attributes to some of your properties. One that I want to touch on in this video is the unique attribute. What we can do with this is tell SwiftData that a property should be unique and that there shouldn't be 2 objects in storage with the same value for that property. So a really good candidate for this is our trip title. We don't want 2 trips to have the same name. So I'm going to go ahead and add the attribute macro. So I'll say attribute, and then mark this as unique. Now that means we can't have 2 trips with the same title. And what's really cool about this is SwiftData automatically knows that if I try to add another object with the same title, then instead of inserting it, it'll update the existing one. It's called an upsert. What's really cool though is that SwiftData then attempts to add an object into persistent storage. And if it finds that one already exists with the same value for a property that's meant to be unique, it then updates that existing property instead of inserting it. It's called an upsert. What's also really cool with SwiftData is that along with the attribute macro, we also get the relationship macro. And that lets us establish relationships between two models. One relationship we're going to look at is the delete rule. And this tells SwiftData what should happen to referenced model types if the referencing model is deleted. So in our case, if we delete a trip, we might want every item in our bucket list to also be deleted from persisted storage. And the way we can do that is by adding the relationship macro. So we can say relationship and then add the cascade. So cascade then cascades, as the name suggests, and deletes every referenced model object. There are a few other options like nullify, no action, or deny, and you can find all of those in Apple's documentation. Now that we've set up our model, we're going to have a look at model context and model containers. We're going to need a model container to create the persistent backend for our models. And setting this up is super simple. All you need to do is specify the model types that you want stored. So with SwiftUI, you can head over to your app, add the model container for, and specify the model types that you want stored. In our case, we want to store a trip. You can also add an array. So if I wanted to add an array like this, I could then reference the bucket list item. But what's really cool about SwiftData is that if a model type is already referenced by one that you've included, it automatically adds those in. So in our case, we only need to add the trip model type here because trip references a bucket list item. So it's done automatically. Once you've got your model container set up, then we will be able to use our model context to be able to query, save, update, and delete any of the values in our persisted storage. So let's go set that up and jump into our trip view. Now, when you're working with SwiftUI, SwiftData comes with a bunch of cool features that you can use straight out of the box with SwiftUI. It goes pretty much hand in hand. And in our case, we're going to be using the query property wrapper. The query property wrapper lets you query the objects in your persisted storage in SwiftData, and even lets you modify the way you filter, sort, or even control the animation that happens on changes. If you do want to filter, what you're going to need to do is create a predicate. And again, now we have a predicate macro that we can use. So let's say I want to filter by all of my trips that have more than one thing on our bucket list. I want to look up all of the really fun activities and the fun trips to go on. So I'm going to create a predicate. So I'll say let fun trips predicate equal, and I'll add the predicate macro. Tell Swift that I want to filter trips. And here I'll just return all of my trips where my bucket list count is greater than 1. Now to query this, it's as simple as importing SwiftData, then adding our query property wrapper, telling Swift I want to filter, sort, and animate. We'll pass in our fun trips predicate, sort on our start date, and our animation will be bouncy. We'll assign this to a variable called trips, and that means we can remove our sample data from here. At this point, if we build and run, we should see a list of nothing since we haven't created any new items yet. As we expected, right? So we can see the trips views loading and things are kind of working in the background, but there are no objects being saved. So what we're going to do is create some objects for us to be able to see in this list. Let's head over to our new trip view, and this is where we reference our model context. So what we're going to do is add our environment for the model context and name this model context. And down here, where we have our save, when we want to save a new item, we can say let new trip equal to trip, and then fill in our title, start date, and our bucket list items. And then we can say model context dot insert and pass in our new trip. Now you might think you need to explicitly call model context.save to add our new trip into our persisted storage. But what's really cool is SwiftData actually out of the box auto saves based on different UI changes or user actions that happen within the app. If you do know for a fact that you need it to be immediate, then you can call model context.save to make sure it's stored right away. But really all it takes is this, and we should have our new object stored in our storage. So if I build and run, I can say create a new trip. And this is new trip. Make sure we add item 1, item 2, and save. And we can see our new trip shows up here. If I create another one, let's say trip 2, and I only add one item in here, you'll notice that it doesn't show up. And that's because of the predicate that we set up to show only the trips that have more than one bucket list item. The final thing I'm going to show you is how you can delete things from SwiftData. Again, this is also just as simple as everything else that you've seen. So we're going to head over to our trips view, and to be able to do this, we also need to reference the model context. So we'll add our model context, and then on our for each, we're going to add an onDelete modifier. We'll map all of the indices in our index set to the objects we want to delete. So we'll map this to our trips, and then iterate over all of those, and we'll say model context dot delete trip, and that should be it. If we build and run, we can see this new trip here. We get this activity, we swipe over, and it's deleted. If I go to add a new one, sample 2, save this, we have it here, add one more, save this, and then let's say I want to delete the top one, and you'll see that the animation is bouncy because we specified that in our query parameter. Now that was inserting and deleting your objects, but if you do want to modify an object in your persistent storage, all you need to do is change the value of the property. It's that simple. To avoid creating a new view, I will use the onDelete to show you what happens, but basically, if we get the trip and we say trip.title plus equals test1, and if we build and run, and if I delete this, now it's updated the title with test1 at the end. All you needed to do was change the value of a property and you've updated the model context. It's that simple. It's so easy to add persistent storage to your apps now with SwiftData, and that pretty much covers SwiftData with SwiftUI. I have seen a lot of questions on whether or not you can use SwiftData with MVVM, and 100% you can. If you want me to create a video on that, leave a comment down below and let me know. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I did, and I will catch you in the next one. Peace.